Deep topics, deep thoughts, deep minds. A warm welcome and thanks for tuning into another deep dive on the Diary of Volunteers on Earth. If you have already seen my little teaser video, then you know that this week's diary entry was all about. And if you haven't, just let me tell you that it was a fascinating conversation about a topic that over the last century or so has become a taboo and a very uncomfortable topic to talk about for a lot of people, I feel like. And that is death and dying. Before we hop in, just a few quick housekeeping words. As you might have seen, the Dove_podcast is now also on TikTok. Actually, I can't believe that I'm saying that. Eventually, I might release a video on my thoughts about TikTok as a platform and why I was very hesitant for a long time to go on there. It's not because of the dancing. Anyways, back to the Dove entry from this week. You might have been wondering, I thought this was a podcast mainly on volunteering. And what does that have to do with death? Well, you are correct. First, let me introduce my guest from this week, Karin. Karin has been a volunteer for over 10 years. And on top of that, she coordinated dozens of other volunteers, and all of that for the styrian organization of Hospice Care and mobile palliative teams, which isn't very easy for me to pronounce. But before we dive any deeper, let me just share her explanation about the differences of hospice and palliative care. Because even though, at least that was my understanding, we sometimes use these two terms kind of synonymously, they are not exactly the same. And probably now that I think about it, the exact definitions vary from country to country or from health system to health system. But I guess, generally speaking, palliative care developed from hospice care and from the hospice care movement. So Karin brought up two names in the podcast, and that was Cicely Saunders and Elizabeth Kübler-Ross. And I had to look them up, I'm going to be honest. And according to Wikipedia, Saunders was a British nurse, a physician, and a writer. And in the 60s, she basically founded the hospice movement. And Elizabeth Kübler-Ross was a psychiatrist who did a lot of research on near-death experiences. And she also wrote a book called On Death and Dying. So if you are curious about these topics, I certainly am. So I might pick those up, although I don't really have a lot of time to read these days. I guess these two are a great point to start if you're curious about it. So, that being said, let's start with something that Karin suggested is enormously important for anyone at any point in their lives to do, at least at some point in their lives. Sorry for being repetitive. I hope that sentence made sense. And that is reflecting on your own mortality. My personal impression is that even just thinking about dying or death, and let alone talking about it in public or even in with your loved ones or in your closest circles, all of that is something that I feel we have made somewhat of a taboo in our society, alongside with, I don't know, sex, drugs, rock and roll. Yeah, at least in the culture that I grew up in, at least in Austria. But I would claim that this is probably similar in most Western cultures. It's a totally different thing in other places in the world. I know, for example, in a lot of Asian countries or African countries, they have a completely different way of dealing and just different cultures and traditions around death and dying. But at least in the Western cultures, the way I see it, we have become almost afraid of dying and death. Like we have like this death phobia. And somehow I have the feeling that this is also somewhat connected to, or I thought maybe even propelled by the decline of importance of religion in the 21st century. And again, this goes for Western cultures. This is from my personal perspective as somebody who was born and raised in Central Europe. So, and I looked up some statistics before recording this podcast, and according to those, in Austria, the percentage of people who don't follow any religion, confession, or community of faith has grown from about 4% to a whopping 22%. And in the US, it's very similar. And this is across the time span of the last 70 years. So that's interesting, I think. But then I went further, and there are some meta-analysis and some studies. And there's one that I looked at from Coventry University, I think in the UK. And it was basically trying to look for a correlation or even a causality or some kind of link between religiousness sounds more correct, and the fear or the avoidance of death. And the conclusion that they came to was that if there is a link, it is probably very weak or subtle. So, that being said, I could think, or I've heard of other reasons, and medically speaking, we just have been so successful to get rid of death and expand our life expectancy that this has naturally or logically led to us just simply not having to deal with death as much. It's actually a very simple explanation. Let me know what you think. I'd be curious, actually. I'm sure there's some interesting opinions out there. So, what is a fact, however, is that the way we deal with dying and death has changed drastically. Nobody can deny that. Again, Western culture mostly. Karin also mentions this on the podcast when she speaks on how it was very normal back in the day, like let's say 100 years ago. It was still very normal to have a wake for somebody who died and have the corpse laid out at the home of the person or the family, and everybody came to say goodbye, and everybody was in very close contact with the deceased. And this is completely changed. And there's actually an American mortician and also an advocate for a more quote-unquote death-informed society. Her name's Caitlin Doughty, and I stumbled across her or upon her because she was featured on a show that I really love, and I can only recommend for any surrealists out there and people who are into stuff like Adventure Time. Midnight Gospel. Shout out to the creator, Duncan Trussell. He's also got a podcast called the Duncan Trussell Family Hour. And it's actually quite a pity that Netflix canceled the show. Anyway, on one of his podcast episodes and also on one of the show's episodes, that lady, Caitlin Doughty, she talks about the Western death anxiety and death phobia. And she proposes that it's all the death industrial complex and funeral industry's fault. And she also proposes that there is nothing morbid about talking about death, because along with birth, death is literally the most universal and most natural thing that we can think of. So I'm not sure if I'm right in making this connection in my mind, but to me, that anxiety around death, it must be super tightly connected to avoiding to reflect on our own mortality. So full circle. Took me about 10 minutes. And personally, I don't know, I have thought about this quite a bit. And for me, and if you know me and if you've followed anything that I did over the past, let's say, 4 years, I've been on a journey. You could call it a spiritual journey or a journey towards myself, maybe. I don't know. And that included thinking about death. It actually even included facing my own death. Yeah, why not? Let's just put this out there. I don't give a crap anymore. So back in 2019, I was in Colombia backpacking with a good friend of mine, and we had a very interesting night. I'm not gonna go too much into details, but feel free to reach out if you want to know. And I ended up, we stayed in a hostel in the jungle. It was probably a 10, 15 minute, maybe 20-minute walk, as far as I remember, from the main road into the jungle. The hostel was right next to a river, and I ended up in the middle of the night having to go back all by myself. Luckily, I think I had my flashlight on my phone, but that was it. And let's just say I was not sober, and I literally thought I was going to die. I was sure that either there's going to be animals that will jump me, or there is going to be some kind of drug lord or, guard of a coca plantation that is going to just split my head open with a machete. I shit you not, this happened. And that made me reflect on my death a lot. And that night has changed quite a bit. There's a few other occasions in my life that have changed, but that was certainly one of them. And yeah, I've talked to this or about this with some of the closest people around me. Now it's on public record. So let me just add, so that you all know, if I die, I don't want my funeral to be sad, okay? I want it to be a remembrance of the beauty of life and the happiness that life is and all the love that we experience during life. I want people to come in whatever clothes that they feel comfortable in. I want them to remember the fun stories. I want them to have good food and a blast. And there's 2 songs that I want to be played at the ceremony, whatever kind of ceremony it will be. And one of them is Free Bird by Lynyrd Skynyrd, because it's got the, in my opinion, most amazing instrumental part of any song in the world. And the other one being If I Ever Leave This World Alive by Flogging Molly, because it's got such a beautiful violin part in it. And ideally, I want some of my good scout friends to perform those songs live. Not sure yet if I want to be buried or in a natural casket. I've read that you can now have like a fungi casket. That would be kind of cool. Or maybe cremation. I'm not sure. We'll see. If I go for cremation, and I haven't completed my dream of visiting every country in the world, I want every person to attend the funeral ceremony to take a part of me, like a part of the ashes, and take them to a country that I haven't been yet. So there you go. Now you know. This is what I want. So yeah, and also like just thinking about my own mortality, my mind usually makes the connection to the Stoic concept of Memento Mori. Some of you might have heard of it. It means remember that you have to die. And I think I'm not alone when I claim that remembering this fact on a regular basis, you don't have to wake up and think about it every single day in the beginning of your day, but on a regular basis to remind yourself is beneficial to one's well-being, especially also the way we want to live our lives. And there are other concepts that are similar. I guess YOLO actually, in principles, was the same thing. You only live once, so you should live your life. I guess Carpe Diem could also be one that is kind of similar. But when it comes to Memento Mori, I do have to credit Ryan Holiday from the Daily Stoic, and go follow him and read his books. Not that I have read his books, but at least I follow him. And he helped me to understand this concept. And he, of course, quotes the Stoic Seneca for all of this. And Seneca apparently used to say that the time that passes every day already belongs to death. Let that sink in. And one thing that Ryan derives from this concept is that we shouldn't be wasting our time with things that aren't important to us. And of course, everybody has their own, priorities and may choose what is important to them. And trust me when I say that I haven't at all implemented this into my own way of living, because I still waste way too much time on a daily basis on stupid shit that is actually not important to me at all. But hey, that's just as much of a step-by-step process as dying is, I guess, in a way. But yeah, the concept of Memento Mori, it really does offer us a different perspective, I think, on our lives, and especially on the time that we have in this life. So the concept basically suggests to me, or what I derive from it, is to just be more present in the moments that matter to us and don't rush through the things that are important to us. And this also ties to something that Karin said during the podcast, that being present is a super important part of hospice care, because the patients, they can tell when somebody isn't present with them. So she was talking about how she has had her own, rituals and traditions before she started her activities, or before she went to spend time with patients. And she was fully present in those moments. And I have to admit that this has actually become something that does annoy me with myself, but also with other people, is that our phones, they make people be less present in the moment, because they are always looking out for what else is happening around them. And I mean, just look at your family table, or when you're with friends, how many people have their phones out on the table? It's actually mind-blowing. And as soon as it buzzes, because of the next notification, the attention shifts away and the presence is gone. So I am convinced this has a huge negative effect on our society. Like I said, I know I'm definitely guilty of that as well occasionally. But that was a massive lesson that I took away from talking to Karin, was to reflect on your own mortality and to be more present. And what was also astounding to me was that Karin was constantly being super, super humble and acknowledging the privilege. She called it a privilege to accompany and care for somebody who's at the end of their life. And I thought that was really amazing. But at the same time, she didn't really shy away from sharing her lessons and her learnings and all the wisdom that she gained from her experiences. Or as she put it at one point in the podcast, quote, the essence that people sometimes can give you just before they pass away. That's powerful. And I actually got goosebumps when she was talking about it because I guess similar to Karin, I do believe in some sort of afterlife and concept of a soul. And she did say that she does believe in that as well on the podcast. And the concept of, nothingness and nothing, and then you have a human lifespan and then nothing again. It has never really made sense to me. I have never really understood it. I couldn't grasp it. So I tend to believe that there is something after life. We just don't know. There's just no way of knowing. And I do love discussions about this topic because I love talking about things like, metaphysics, spirituality, psychology, philosophy, whatever. One thing that Karin said is going to change my approach in these sort of discussions, because I have to be honest, I do occasionally find myself in the position of trying or wanting to convince others of my own views, as opposed to trying to understand their point of view. And I have to say that I have been trying to work on that over the last couple of years, but hearing it in the context of hospice care reminded me of one important thing, that any sort of stance, view, belief, or opinion in terms of the afterlife or whatever is okay. If somebody wants to believe something else, that's totally fine. Let's not evangelize, Karin suggests. And the same actually goes for dealing with death or terminal illness. On an individual basis, it must be okay for family members to handle and cope loss in different ways. It just has to be. And again, I did do some research, and it does seem to be backed by scientists. For example, George Bonanno, who proposed the idea of grief trajectories. Remember Elisabeth Kübler-Ross? She came up with the phases of grief model, and today that model is, being criticized, and a lot of people have shifted away from it. And Bonanno was one of the people who came up with another model, and that is the one of the grief trajectories. That there are some prototypical trajectories that are common when we have to deal with loss and we have to grieve. And some of those are, for example, resilience, recovery, chronic dysfunction, or also delayed grief. And he postulates that resilience seems to be the most common one. And interestingly enough, according to George Bonanno, resilience does seem to have not a toxic nature, a paradoxical nature, which means that it's almost impossible to predict whether a person is going to be resilient or not when they have to face grief, which I thought was really interesting. So I'll put his work in the show notes for anyone who's interested. But before I lose myself, let's get back to Karin and the podcast. Like I said in the beginning, volunteering is not necessarily something that people think of when they hear hospice or palliative care. Of course, volunteering is only one aspect of hospice care. And on the podcast, Karin actually pointed out that the variety of expertise within those teams is one thing that makes it so valuable, because there's physicians, medical doctors, psychiatrists, nurses, pastoral care, even legal counseling. There's so many different people on those palliative and hospice care teams. And that makes it a very holistic concept, Karin says. And this kind of, mesh of services is exactly what makes it so special for families who need it. And volunteering adds another element, as Karin points out. Sometimes somebody who has no ties whatsoever to either the patient, the patient's family, or the other fields that I just mentioned, is the best person for the patient to confide in and to talk to about certain problems. Sometimes the patient may want to tell the volunteer something that they feel like they can't tell anyone else. And Karin gave the example that sometimes they want to tell somebody how shitty they really feel, but they can't tell their family because they would feel that they would make the burden even bigger, and also maybe on the professionals and the medic staff. And that's where the volunteers come in. So that's the connection for you guys, if it wasn't clear until now. And then there's one more thing that I wanted to cover before I let you guys go. It seems like half an hour is a good time frame for these deep dives. One more thing was the openness that Karin mentioned on the podcast multiple times, actually. Especially when I asked her what her biggest and most transformational takeaways were. She said that to keep your heart wide and open. And I absolutely loved when she said that, because probably this is also something that I have learned over the years. And it's definitely something that I am constantly practicing, because it sure ain't easy to keep your heart open, because it means that you are being vulnerable. It means that you are dropping your guards. It means that you're dropping your masks, and that you're wanting and trying to be yourself as much as you can. And I'm sure some of you will know what I'm talking about. It's a fucking scary thing to do. And I think at least, it requires a lot of time and even more trust in the fact that things are going to be all right, even if you open yourself up. And I know I just said fact. Obviously, nobody can know this for sure and as a fact. But I do think that there is something, I don't know, that just, creates a way and a path for us that it will be all right. And if we just if we open ourselves up to that, things are going to be fine. And I'm certainly not there yet. And even though I might not be as scared of death as other people, I'm still scared of other things. I'm super scared of judgment and of the public reception of the things I do. I'm scared of social consequences that I may or may not have to deal with if I were more myself and if I would open up more. So there you go. But being open, I think, is a prerequisite for something that is universal. Because being open also enables us to receive. It enables us to receive love and to be loved. We have to be open for that. If we are closed, there's no way. How could we if our hearts are closed? And when I told Karin that I believe that love is the glue that holds together our universe, And love is the place to be. Shout out to Bilderbuch and their song Liebe ist the place to be. Ich bin bereit für diese Galaxie. Anyways, Karin's reply couldn't have been more beautiful when I said that. She said, I believe that in our true nature, we are pure love. But we have just forgotten it. Goosebumps. I think this is a great way to end this deep dive. Thanks for tuning in. Share Dove with a friend if you liked it. Go vote on the Ö3 Podcast Award. Much love, much peace. Until next time.